And so those top two is the prevailing attitude that you find in organisations, unfortunately. Why have we got this problem? Well, one of the reasons that's put forward is that basically we've got brains that emerged to do some fairly simple things. Find food and find mates. And so our strategic thinking, by and large, is about where's the next meal coming from, or where's my next mate coming from. And it's only fairly recently in human evolution that we've had the time and the inclination to think further into the future. And we're not very good at it. There's been some work done by Richard Slaughter, who's someone I'll refer to later with respect to strategic foresighting, where he looked at ability to think about multiple possible futures. And what he found was that as individuals, we do it fairly well. We all carry around rehearsals of the way the future might turn out. So if we miss a bus, we know what to do. We either catch another bus, or we walk, or we get a taxi. If our child gets sick, we know what to do. In organisations and as a society, we tend to close that down and just assume someone else is doing that thinking. And so we end up with organisations and societies that don't think very well about possibilities, that lower left-hand quadrant that I was talking about. And the consequence can be fairly disastrous. Some of the work that's come out recently by people like Jared Diamond and Joseph Tainter have looked at why societies have collapsed in the past. And of course there's a whole range of reasons, but three of the prominent ones are failure to think about what might happen in the future, failure to be looking to see what of those possibilities might be coming about, and then failure to have thought about how you might respond. And I guess the fourth one is responding in a pretty bad way. So, you know, it's not a trivial thing to not think strategically. And the major conclusion that came out of the inquiry into September 11 in the US was that the main failure was a failure of imagination, failure to imagine that something like that could happen. And there's lots of stories I could tell like that. So how do we deal with that sort of unhelpful thinking? I'm going to just cover a few of the approaches. There's many approaches that we can take. I want to talk about strategic thinking as against strategic planning, just briefly. Talk about systems thinking and systems models. I'll say a little bit about agent-based models, which is a type of complex adaptive system modelling, scenario planning, strategic foresight, and then one of the sort of emerging areas at the moment that's a bit of a buzzword, resilience. Now, in the business literature, for those of you that are doing business degrees, you'll know lots and lots of frameworks for strategic thinking, and one of the more simple and yet most popular is by Henry Mintzberg, a Canadian business strategist, and he talks about 7 ways of seeing. Seeing ahead, seeing behind, seeing above, seeing below, seeing besides, seeing beyond, and seeing it through. Now, this is a fairly uncomplicated way of thinking about complexity, and yet when you present this sort of diagram to most public servants, it's a huge revelation. They realise that most of this they don't do. And I'm not picking on public servants. Most of us in any sort of decision-making situation don't even address complexity at this level. But nevertheless, there are frameworks like this that are around that prompt people to say, have you thought about what happened in the past? Have you thought about the way things might go in the future? Have you looked somewhere else to see if something's happening that might inform you about what you're currently doing? Another model comes from a fellow called Hardin Tibbs, who's one of the strategists with a group called the Global Business Network. He talks about a strategic landscape. And what I like about this framework is that he points out that you can have a big objective, which is kind of like a star in the sky, and you can have a big obstacle, which is like some mountains you've got to climb. And quite often people think, well, that's what strategic thinking is about. But he points out that, well, before you can get to the mountain, there's this chessboard, which is day-to-day activities. And there's a whole lot of complexity there. You've got to understand the sort of moves that other people can make and the moves that you can make, the constraints you work under. This is all part of the complexity of decision-making in a day-to-day basis. And then there's the complexity of understanding yourself, your own preferences, your own strengths and weaknesses in thinking, and how you interact with other people and what their strengths and weaknesses are. So there's layers upon layers of complexity here just in thinking about where are we heading, say, as a work group, or is it where am I heading in terms of a career. So this stuff is, you know, this is not all just about order in the universe. This is about day-to-day living in a complex world. Just very briefly, We all talk about strategic planning, and in theory, strategic planning should be informed by good strategic thinking. What tends to happen in practice, though, is when you do strategic planning, the overall objective is to develop a plan. And it's usually done in the quickest possible way, usually a morning if you can get away with it, a whole day if you really have to. Whereas strategic thinking needs to be happening all the time. You need to be asking yourself, what's my idea of the way the world's working? And then test that idea and continue to build your understanding of complexity without ever believing that you can fully understand it. So I just wanted to make that point about that distinction in case you were thinking about it. Now, one of the tools that policymakers use to deal with complexity is a thing called the policy cycle. This is a highly rational way to make decisions, and you're supposed to start by identifying the issue that you're dealing with, understand... now, did I jump? No, that's all right. Understand what's causing the issue, generate some options for solving it, then think about what the implications of those options are, and more people are thinking about how do you strategically communicate your ideas and get them taken up. And more often than not, you'll come back around again. Now, what I've found with my work with organisations, more often than not, they don't get the issue right, and they go off and develop a great plan for an issue that's different from the one that they started out with. Quite often, they don't bother to think deeply about what's causing the problem. They jump in with what looks like the obvious cause. So again, they're developing a plan for dealing with something that's probably not going to work. They've usually already got options in mind. In fact, quite often, they define the issue in terms of the options that they've already got available, and then they don't even bother to think about the implications, and so you get perverse policy outcomes, and most of them haven't got a clue about strategic communication. And again, I'm not picking on policymakers, because I think we all do elements of this all the time, which I'll come back to later. So what do you do about this? Well, I just want to give you some examples of some of the approaches to thinking about what the issue is here. And one of those was developed by Michel Godet and his group at the French Futures School. One of the things they do with organisations is they start by saying, what are the assumptions that you have about the future and about your role in the future? And then he challenges them, and he says, why do you have that? What's the evidence for that assumption? And even if you have evidence that that assumption holds now, what's your evidence that it will hold in the future? Under what circumstances might it not hold? And what we find is that most organisations are planning on the basis of a whole lot of assumptions, many of which don't hold now and may not hold in the future. When you ask an organisation to do some planning about its future, very rarely do they voluntarily think of a future where they don't exist. And yet that's always a distinct possibility, and also a possibility you should think about. So we labour under those assumptions, and so one of the simplest ways of dealing with complexity is to start examining our assumptions. There's a really nice technique that's been developed by an Australian Muslim futurist called Sohail Niatoullah. He lives on the Sunshine Coast, and he developed this approach because he was really concerned as a Muslim with the way that people in society don't understand one another's worldviews and the way that they identify issues. So he says that we often identify issues in terms of what we see on the surface. This is supposed to be an iceberg, in case you hadn't worked that out, and that's water. But what we see is interpreted by different people in terms of the perceptions they have about causes, and they are informed by their underlying views of the world. And we can get an inkling of what those views are by listening to the sorts of myths and metaphors, the stories that they tell. We are, as a species of storytellers. That's how we communicate. And there's a whole field of psychology that's about the sort of stories we tell, the metaphors and myths that we use to make sense of the world. And there's not many of them. Probably the most popular one is the Cinderella story, because we all like to think that one day we'll marry the prince or the princess. The whole American culture is built on a princess story. All the stories in the papers about Barack Obama's rise to presidency is a Cinderella story.